Welcome everyone to the Ridgefield Library. My name is Andy Forsythe. I am the Assistant Library Director, and it is my pleasure to have you, Ralph Blumenthal, and our board member Mark Bigliotti here this afternoon to cover a fascinating topic. I also want to give a big thank you to Books on the Common, a long-standing partner. They're in the back. A shout out. They've got books for sale and for signing, and we are so fortunate to have such a great independent bookstore here in Ridgefield. So, yeah. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Bigliotti, a Ridgefield resident and a member of the Board of Directors of the Ridgefield Library. He is also the host of the podcast, All Across America, and he will be joining Ralph in conversation today. Thank you.
Okay, let me do this. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. All right, thank you, Andy. Thank you all for coming today. I think this is going to be a very special event. I think it's going to be one that we'll look back upon and say, I was there. This is the frontier in futurism, the frontier in science, inquiry, and philosophical thought. And we're very grateful for the library for hosting us today. Believe it or not, this is one out of 1,400 events that the library holds every year. So it's thanks to our amazing staff like Andy, thanks to all of you. So the library only receives 7% of its support from the town. The other 30% comes from our generous patrons. So please consider making a gift to the library. I'd like to introduce Ralph Blumenthal. Ralph is, Ralph, I got a few comments I'll say, but come on up, please. Ralph Blumenthal is a graduate of City College. He's a graduate of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. He began his career in 1963 in Grand Prairie Daily News in Grand Prairie, Texas. He moved to the New York Times in 1964, where he had a 45-year-long career up until 2009. He was a foreign correspondent in what was then South Vietnam during the Vietnam War, in Cambodia, also in West Germany. When he came back stateside, he was an investigative and crime reporter, an arts and cultural writer. He led the team on the Metro desk that won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting in 1993 on the World Trade Center bombing. Ralph is a Guggenheim Fellow and author of 7 nonfiction books. And he is a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College at the City University of New York. And he also co-authored the December 2017 story in the New York Times with Elena Cooper and Leslie Keene. The article was titled Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program. And that article has been widely credited for introducing UFOs and the new phenomenon and the new enthusiasm worldwide, which brings us here today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ralph Blumenthal.
Said that there are 1,400 events in the library. I thought I was special.
You are very special, very special.
It's very humbling to hear that. But anyway, thank you for being here.
Yes, well, thank you for having us. I'm just going to grab my water bottle up there. So Grand Prairie, Texas. What brought you down there?
Well, Grand Prairie doesn't exist anymore, by the way. It's been subsumed by the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. But in my day, I had just graduated from City College of New York, and I was looking for something to do for a while. I had applied to Columbia Journalism School.
Okay.
That wouldn't start till September, so I had time off. So I went down there, and it was a great summer, actually, to be in Texas. It was the summer before the Kennedy assassination, and there was a lot of ferment there. I look back on it now. It was a very dark time in Texas. So that's what I was doing in Grand Prairie.
All right, and then you moved to the Times in '64.
I did.
And so tell me, you've had a 45-year-long career. What to you have been the stories that have stuck out to you most?
Well, that's a hard question because I did cover a lot of different things. I was in Vietnam, as you mentioned, for the Vietnam War. Before that, I was in West Germany for the Times at a time when the wall had recently gone up. It was a very turbulent time in Western Europe. My bureau chief in Bonn had the idea at the time, because the Russians had just invaded Czechoslovakia on top of everything else, and he thought it would be great for me to fly back and forth into Berlin to see if the Russians were interrupting the flight paths or shooting down planes. That was his idea. I said, that's a great story, but I won't be writing it. Yeah, they tell you don't become the story. But, you know, looking back, I mean, the UFO experience, which happened after I left the Times, really does stand out because that's the issue of the moment.
Okay, all right. Well, why don't we jump to it? If we could talk about the glowing auras and Black Money story, December 17th, 2017. Tell us how it came to be. Maybe you can give a synopsis for folks that are unfamiliar with it.
Okay. So the story starts long before 2017, when the story broke on the front page of the New York Times. In 2003, I was the New York Times correspondent in Texas, and covering the Southwest and Texas, an interesting time. It's always an interesting time in Texas, I can tell you that. You can throw a rock and whatever it hits is a story. But I happened to pick up, I used to haunt used bookstores, and Larry McMurtry, by the way, had a big used bookstore.
Oh, of course, got a whole town.
The whole town.
Yes.
So in one of these used bookstores, I don't think it was Archer City where Larry's from, but I picked up a copy of a book, Passport to the Cosmos, which I'd never heard of. It was by a guy named John Mack, professor of psychiatry at Harvard. And it was his second book about his research into alien abduction, people who had come to see him with stories about being abducted by aliens, which he found extremely strange, especially since these people had no discernible mental illness.
Okay.
So he investigated and realized that there was something going on that he couldn't explain. To this day, he can't explain it. And he recorded it in 2 books, and I picked up a second book. And I thought, this is really interesting. I got to call this guy for a story for the Times. I had no idea how famous he already was. Which he was. He was notorious, actually. He got into trouble at Harvard.
He was on Oprah?
He was on Oprah. He had been profiled in the New York Times, which I missed completely. And Harvard had actually opened a secret, what I call an inquisition, against him, which cleared him in the end as having done nothing really wrong. Anyway, I thought I'd give him a call. It'd be a good story. And 3 or 4 days later, I picked up the New York Times to find out he'd been run over and killed in London by a drunk driver. He had gone there for he was a Pulitzer Prize winner for a book he did, a biography of Lawrence of Arabia, T.T. Lawrence. So 30 years later, he was in London talking about his Lawrence biography, which remains famous. And he was hit and run, knocked down and killed. So I couldn't interview him, obviously, but I was more intrigued than ever. I reached out to his family, and they didn't want to talk to me, not surprisingly. But eventually, I did more research, and they did agree to share his files with me. He was a voluminous saver at Harvard, and he recorded his analyses, because every psychiatrist has to go through his own analysis. So his secret thoughts were coming out in his analysis, which he recorded, which were part of his archive that I saw and heard. So I realized that I'd really gotten a great trove of information on this guy, and I got more intrigued than ever. Harvard psychiatrist, interested in aliens, etc. So that started me off. It took me 17 years to do that book, which I call The Believer. This is a long, roundabout answer to your question about how I got into the New York Times, because I was working on the John Mack book from 2004, when he was killed, on and off. Not daily, but pretty, on and off, and deliberately and diligently. And in the course of my research into John Mack, I met someone called Leslie Kean, who's probably the premier UFO writer in the country. She had been the companion of Bud Hopkins, who has an own interesting story. He was an artist who got interested in UFOs and did his own research, taught himself hypnosis, and he talked to people with UFO experiences. And he was the one who got John Mack interested in UFOs and the alien abduction phenomenon. So in October of 2017, while I was working on the John Mack book, Leslie told me that she had just come back from Washington, D.C., and she had met some high-level intelligence people who confided to her that the government, despite everything we knew, or thought we knew, did have a UFO investigations unit in the Pentagon. We called it ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. So she came to me with that story, that the government had this UFO unit in the Pentagon. She also had 3 videos of encounters between Navy pilots and UFOs. Wasn't that a great story to take to the New York Times? So I agreed. I was off the Times by then, but I still had contacts there. I emailed the executive editor, Dean Baquet, and told him, not in great detail, because you have to boil it down in an email, but I try to be as dramatic as I could, and I said this is a world-changing story about a secret operation in the government, a war with a race with the Russians, which it was, to develop ultra-high technology, mythological program, all that. And not surprisingly, they bid for the story. We had it all on the record, all our stories for the Times and other publications only quoted people on the record because readers need the comfort of knowing who's talking in the story. We don't like anonymous sources. So anyway, that's the story we came to the Times with. They went for it, and they ran it on the front page on December 17th, 2017. It ran on the website before that with 2 and quickly 3 videos of these encounters, which have now become kind of legend. These videos, every time you Google UFOs, you'll see one of these videos that are Pentagon videos. Anyway, so the story broke. It caused a huge uproar because it was really the first time that the mainstream media devoted its attention to the subject in a serious way. A lot of things followed from that. But that's the story how that came to be.
All right. And if you can give us kind of a brief synopsis, Commander David Fravor was in the story as well.
Yes.
Top end trained fighter pilot, Harry Reid.
Yeah. What was interesting is that Harry Reid, then the Senate Majority Leader, had gotten, this was part of the original story, had gotten $22 million in black money, secret funding, for this Pentagon office called ATIP. It came under other names, but we called it that. And a fellow named Lou Elizondo, a high-level intelligence guy, was the head of the office. None of this had been public before that, and I mean, nobody knew anything about this. And what I didn't mention before, but was equally sensational, was that Elizondo had just submitted his resignation to Defense Secretary Jim Mattis because he said he was being sabotaged at a very high level in the Pentagon in his efforts to run this UFO office because superiors found the subject demonic. They were actually fundamentalists who thought that nobody should be monkeying around with this issue. So Elizondo sent a letter of resignation to Mattis, but superiors would not even transmit the letter to Mattis because they were afraid of Mattis's reaction. So he resigned, but Mattis didn't know it, which made it a better story. Anyway, that sort of ended up coming out later. But so that's a little more on that how that story came out.
So Harry Reid, I mean, what has struck me about this story and what has attracted me to it is just the level of folks. The higher up you go, you wrote in The Believer, the more likely people are to take this subject seriously. And the initial $22 million in funding had come from Senators Harry Reid, Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, and Ted Stevens of Alaska. All 3 of whom have international airports named after them. Ted Stevens was a fighter pilot in World War II, was trailed by what were then known as Foo Fighters for miles and had a lifelong fascination. Daniel Inouye was a World War II hero as well, actually gave his right arm during World War II. The only American to be awarded the National Medal of Freedom and then the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest civilian military honors. You've got Commander David Fravor, again, a Top Gun trained pilot. He was in charge of the airspace on 9/11 over LA and securing that. You have, Alexander Dietrich, also a Top Gun trained fighter pilot, one of the first female fighter pilots in U.S. history. It sounds like I'm making this stuff up, but these are very, very serious folks. When you've talked about this story in your travels and your work, have you found that people, the everyday folks snicker still, whereas people high up in government take this very seriously?
Yeah, there still is a ridicule factor here, which is sad because people are afraid to come forward with their UFO experiences. I should also say that, Dave Fravor, who we quoted in a sidebar to that first story, had witnessed a most amazing thing. He was, as you said, a decorated fighter pilot, and he had seen what he later called a tic-tac, like the candy, but huge, flying up there with his jet. And at one point, he saw this tic-tac fly down to the surface of the water, and there was something underneath the water, churning under the water. So that comes in later when we realize that UFOs are not just in the air, they're underwater as well. But so Fravor added a very important element to that story. And in a way, Stevens had their own experiences, UFO experiences, as a lot of people have in high-level positions, as you suggested, but don't often talk about it. But they all had some, and Harry Reid too, had some more than just a passing interest in UFOs. He really had some reason from his own experiences and talking to people to believe that there was something going on here that the government was covering up.
All right. And on the subject of Harry Reid, he had said, I think towards the end of his life, he considered himself a bit of a folk hero and kind of reveled in that. He had said, I think in the New Yorker, that he was told that Lockheed Martin had these so-called craft retrievals for decades, but he seemed to waver on how committed he was to those statements. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Harry Reid was very cautious, as many members of Congress were and are, about broaching this issue. Now we're seeing a sort of breaking of that taboo a little bit, more than ever before, so that's refreshing. But he was very cautious, and he didn't want to get too far ahead of the information. And by the way, he was also very close to Robert Bigelow, who's an aerospace entrepreneur. He has a habitat attached to the International Space Station. He's a great follower of anomalous phenomena. He had a property in Utah known as Skinwalker Ranch, an old Native American property that has been witness to the most extraordinary things in terms of portals to another world and strange objects and anomalous things, giant wolves. I mean, there's a whole book about it. So Reid and Bigelow were very close, and the money that Reid got to fund this research program, the $22 million, a lot of it went to Bigelow, because Bigelow had a research capability in Las Vegas. Reid is from Las Vegas, Bigelow's from Las Vegas. So Bigelow was able to put together a research team, and to this day we don't know all the things that they came up with, because he's a private entrepreneur, it's secret. Along with Lockheed Martin and defense contractors, who may be the places where these craft, we will get to that, are being hidden today. Because another witness has come forward, we'll talk about him, who said that the government is in possession of alien craft, pieces and intact craft. I haven't seen them, I haven't put my hands on them, but we can talk about that. That's what's hanging in abeyance here. What we weren't able to say in the New York Times was that the government is in possession of some of these craft. That's the big question, so we'll see.
And turning to the follow-up story that you've done in July 23rd of 2020, entitled "No Longer in the Shadows, Pentagon's UFO Unit Will Make Some Findings Public," There's probably the most sensational quote ever to appear in the New York Times in its history, and I'll read it to you. It's by Dr. Eric W. Davis. He said he gave a classified briefing to a Defense Department agency as recently as March 2020 about retrievals from off-world vehicles not made on this earth. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it appeared at the very end of the article?
Getting stories in the New York Times is not easy. I can testify to that from 45 years at the New York Times. And it's good. I mean, they're very careful in their editing. I was very familiar with the process in all my years there, and not just about UFOs, but about anything. I mean, I covered corruption for many years, and they want to make sure that you have the facts correctly, and that there are no mistakes, and there are no lawsuits that result. So they have a very rigorous, fact-checking and editing process. So when Leslie and I came in with the story that Eric Davis, who's a astrophysicist and a defense contractor with very solid credentials, when we heard that he had briefed members of House and Senate committees about actual retrievals of off-Earth material, pieces of UFOs, you could say. That was in itself kind of sensational, that he had, in other words, it wasn't just somebody saying this. This was somebody who had told members of Congress, or Congressional committees, more precisely, about this. So we had that information, but in getting it into a Times story, and the back and forth with different editors, which I'm not going to really get into details about, but it got shoved down in the story.
Okay.
So you have to read those stories. I urge you, if you're reading a UFO story in the New York Times particularly, read through the whole story. Because the most important thing may not be up at the top. It may be sort of slipped in somewhere.
Isn't that called burying the lead?
It is burying the lead. We thought it was the lead, but we also were sympathetic to their caution, and they didn't want to be too far out front on this. They were out front, by the way.
So in a follow-up article to that, I mean, these were such big articles that you had articles about the articles that you wrote, and a few days later, you and Leslie came and wrote On the Trail of a Secret UFO Program, and you wrote that Helene met with Pentagon's spokesperson on December 8th for a response to the information we had gathered. The answer came swiftly. There had been a program to investigate UFOs, but it ended in 2012 after 5 years. The Defense Department insisted. Our reporting suggests that it continues largely unfunded to the president, and that's what we wrote. So, in your opinion, do you feel that the Department of Defense is withholding information from the American people?
Yes.
Okay.
They have a long history of that, and I wrote about that in The Believer. The government's role in this field, this very strange field of UFOs, is not an exemplary one. I mean, way back in the 50s, the government was very disingenuous. It stigmatized the subject. It actually worked with Walt Disney and other mass media, icons to ridicule the subject, to suggest that anyone coming forward with a UFO story was nuts. Why the government did this is an interesting story. First of all, the government couldn't protect Americans against this phenomenon because nobody knew what it was to this day. These things are continuing to fly around in the skies over Ridgefield and everywhere else. And nobody knows what they are, how they can do what they do, how they can operate apparently underwater as well. So the government took the position that, well, we don't know what these things are, and we don't want to panic the people, so we're going to just suggest that they don't really exist, that they are weather balloons or natural phenomena, hallucinations. And that attitude continued for many, many years, to the point where people with information were afraid to come forward. They were stigmatized, even members of Congress. Even presidents like Jimmy Carter, who had a sighting of a UFO, was ridiculed for it, never made much of it. So that's the problem. Now we're seeing really a change of tone. because of the congressional hearings, to this day so far, and periodic reports mandated by Congress. Congress is becoming more courageous in demanding information. A lot of things are changing,
Right.
but the government has hidden this stuff.
Okay. In the Schumer amendment of the National Defense Authorization Act, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the National Defense Authorization Act, last year, another one's coming up now for the next year, fiscal year ahead, authorizes defense spending for the following year. Last year, a very crucial amendment, a series of amendments went in with that authorization called basically the whistleblower statutes, which protected or said it was going to protect people with knowledge of UFO activity if they came forward to certain official government channels. In other words, not if they just talked to the New York Times, but if they had information through their intelligence work, and they had, even if they had signed a non-disclosure agreement as a part of that, but they knew that there was information out there that should be in the possession of Congress, they could come forward through these channels and give this information. That was in the National Defense Authorization Act, whistleblower statutes, and that becomes very important with a guy named David Grusch,
Right.
who we'll talk about.
Right.
But so that was the amendment that was put in to the Authorization Act, and on its face, anyway, it seemed to protect people with information, because remember, Congress is supposed to be the one authorizing expenditures and programs, and if information is being withheld from Congress, well, that's a crime, that's illegal. If Congress is supposed to have information that it can't get because people are lying to Congress or withholding that information, that's a problem. So this was intended to get these people out of the shadows, to come forward, to let Congress know that there are retrieval programs, that we have retrieved, or there are entities that have retrieved craft not of this earth, things like that. So that was in that act,
Right.
and we're seeing the results of that now, not completely, but it's helping.
Now, there's also that part of that act, Senator Schumer's act, that within 6 months it mandates that any private or public entities that are in possession of quote-unquote non-human intelligence craft must return them by eminent domain to the United States
Yeah,
government.
good luck with that. That ain't gonna happen. Because what we found, by the way, in our reporting, Leslie and I, and Helene, was that defense contractors are a great place to hide information and probably actual craft. They are not amenable to the Freedom of Information Act, so they don't have to answer to members of the public. And they are much better at hiding things than the government itself. And the government is used to dealing with defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and the other big contractors. McDonnell Douglas and a whole bunch of them. So there have been hints like the one you just mentioned that that's where these craft are being hidden, but no one can get at it so far.
So let's turn to The Believer, and you had mentioned you have been writing this book for over 16 years. Was it an evolution of your time with the New York Times? Did you all of a sudden feel this kind of release, having retired, you can kind of go off and do your own thing? How did it all come about?
Well, I started on the book before I retired from the Times in 2009, and I've done a number of books, and each one sort of came to me kind of on its own somehow, serendipitously. I find that very interesting. Maybe other authors have had the same experience, but these books have sort of, and this one, as I said, grew out of that chance encounter with John Mack's book, Passport to the Cosmos. Believe me, I had no interest in UFOs until then, and I was just curious. This guy, this Harvard professor, was so taken with with these stories of aliens, So I started on the book while I was still at the Times, but when I left, I had more time to work on it. So that's how that came about.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about his work and the patients that he met with. And there are some people that say that a lot of this was revealed under hypnosis, and they're less likely to believe something revealed under hypnosis than fully conscious thought.
Right. Well, Mack, first of all, he had a very conventional upbringing. He grew up in a German Jewish household in New York, a wealthy family, by the way. His mother died when he was very young, which is really what has a role in his interest in the abnormal later. But she came from a very wealthy family of brewers, Rheingold beer, actually. Remember the elections for Miss Rheingold? And the commercials, my beer is Rheingold, the dry beer. Anyway, Rheingold's not much of a presence now, but anyway, she came from a very wealthy family. He grew up in a very conventional household and became a psychiatrist. He, by the way, just off today's headlines, he was a great social activist. He met with Yasser Arafat to try to come up with a peace plan for the Palestinians. We know how that went. He was an anti-nuclear activist. He got arrested in Nevada protesting nuclear weapons. He was very involved in social causes, but not necessarily anomalous events. But what happened is he started getting interested in a breathing discipline called holotropic breath work, which I'd never heard of. It's a way of controlled breathing that can bring on an altered state of consciousness without drugs. Better living without chemistry, as the old GE slogan went. So by this regulated breathing, to rhythmic breathing, to music often, in a darkened environment with other people, he attained a different stage of consciousness. At one time he thought it wasn't having any effect on him, and suddenly he was a peasant in the 16th century in Russia watching his son being decapitated by the Mongols. At least that's what image came to him. Wow. So he realized that there was more to life than the material world that he'd been brought up in. So he got sort of interested in these strange psychic experiments, and then he heard through one of these breathing groups that there was a guy named Bud Hopkins who was, even though he was an artist, was very involved in UFOs and alien abduction experiences. So the woman who introduced him said, "Would you like to meet Bud Hopkins?" He said, "No, if he believes that, he's probably crazy." So then Mack finds himself in New York in 1990, I believe, or 91. And something strange impels him to call Bud Hopkins. And that's in my book. It's very strange why we do certain things. And when he met Bud Hopkins, Hopkins showed him, Bud Hopkins had just written a book about these abduction experiences. People had written him letters saying, "This happened to me and this happened to me." And he said to Mack, "You look at these letters. You're the psychiatrist. I'm an artist. You tell me if there's something going on here." So Mack was very skeptical, but he took the letters and it blew him away. He could not believe that ordinary people were having these experiences. And as I said, to this day, we do not understand at all why some people have them, other people don't. Mack never had them, I have never had them, but other people have. So he got interested in that, and he was courageous enough, by the way, to pursue it, even at a time when Harvard was not happy with that. They thought it reflected badly on Harvard. The word got out. It was no secret that he was doing this. He was on Oprah. He gave talks about it. He even gave talks at Harvard about it. So he wasn't shy about it. He was mystified. And as I said, he wasn't intimidated by the unconventionality of the subject and the bizarreness of it all. So, and because he had such a high standing at Harvard, he was an esteemed professor of psychiatry. He'd won a Pulitzer Prize, which his colleagues would never let him forget. Academic jealousy and all that. And he had a thick skin, and he had enough money, so he felt a little bit shielded. And he was not easily intimidated. So, and that's what set him off.
So can you talk about what you would call the Inquisition, a 14-month Harvard investigation?
Yeah, so as I said, he wasn't shy about his research. He was actually giving seminars at Harvard about the things he was finding out. In fact, that ordinary people from all walks of life, and even little children, by the way, who were too young to read books about UFOs, and they were too young to go to movies about UFOs, they were telling their parents things like, you know, at night, little man, take me up in the sky. So he was, Mack, who was very good with children, child psychology as well, wondered how it was possible that all these different people were reporting basically the same experience. There were a lot of little variations, but people would be taken up in a craft, they would be experimented on, and there would be sexual experiments to remove sperm from men and eggs from women. They would later see their hybrid children, they would tell Mack. All completely bizarre. And when he was saying all this publicly, Harvard was not happy, so they convened a secret inquisition, it was not public, calling him in, and Mack, being very naive, of course, being invited by the head of the medical school to come in and talk, came right in, and then his nephew said to him at one point, "You must be out of your mind, you cannot go into an inquiry like that without a lawyer." So he ended up getting lawyers. He got two very good lawyers, Eric McLeish, who wrote the priest abuse scandal in Boston. He was in that movie Spotlight. Danny Sheehan, who's a kind of a rogue lawyer who investigated the Ku Klux Klan and Iran-Contra arms scandal. And together, they really held Harvard's feet to the fire. But until they did that, Mack was being summoned for regular sessions. As I said, it was never leaked at the time. It was completely secret. And they were questioning him about his scientific methodology, his beliefs, his finances. And in the end, they found nothing wrong. They found he was a little too enthusiastic about, you know, the whole alien business, and they told him to tone it down, which he did. He realized, yeah, I was a little too enthusiastic, but he had not done anything wrong. But that was the Harvard Inquisition.
Okay. And you quoted, I guess he engaged in what was deemed forbidden science. You also quoted in your, the notes of the book, Shaking the Pear Tree of Science. Do you feel that science is open for change? And I mean, it's now being led at Harvard now with Avi Loeb, who was the former chair of the astronomy department at Harvard and still is in good standing there. Is that shifting?
To an extent, and not to an extent. The scientific establishment is still very orthodox. A lot of scientists will not go near the UFO issue. Avi Loeb being an exception, by the way, and I've talked to his group.
The Galileo Project.
The Galileo Project, and I was going to say he did some interesting work recently. He went to the waters off New Guinea to find an object that plunged into the water there in 21, I don't know, well, within the last few years, something went into the water there, and they're looking for remnants of it, whether it was a natural object or a UFO or whatever, and he's retrieved some pieces, and they're having them analyzed. He's also got a lot of splashback, backlash. Avi Loeb has, although he comes at the subject very differently from Mack. He's much more scientifically oriented because he's an astrophysicist and Mack was a psychiatrist, so completely different disciplines. But anyway, the scientific community is still very orthodox, afraid to really engage with this subject. Mack got a lot of pushback from colleagues who said they were not interested in what he was finding. They thought he was a publicity hound, I mean, all kinds of things. So even Einstein, by the way, complained about the scientific community, I found. He found them much too hidebound and not open to a real inquiry. So that is a problem. The research follows certain predictable lines. They don't research things that are really outlandish, like how come so many people have these strange experiences, and what's going on in the brains of these people, which I think is the next frontier of research. Like, what happens when these people have these strange experiences? That is being looked at to a limited extent, but not enough. So to answer your question, yes, the scientific establishment is still very reluctant to get into this subject.
So if we can maybe talk about the Ariel school incident, and you could talk about that and John Mack's involvement in that.
Okay, so in the course of his research at Harvard, he kept hearing stories about things that were happening, and he kept investigating them, right through what I call the Harvard Inquisition. Even while he was being summoned to Harvard to answer questions about, why did you do this and why did you do that, he heard about an incident at a school outside Harare, Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia, in southern Africa, where 60 kids at a recess at a day school saw a craft land and two little beings get out, or so they later told teachers, and they had telepathic communication with these two little beings, little short characters that come up again and again in these stories. So, and it happened, by the way, at a time of recess, when all the teachers were not there at the recess ground. They just let the kids play by themselves. So, did the aliens know this was a good time to appear? When they asked John Mack that, he said, "I'm not an alien psychiatrist, I don't know." But it's just one of the many little mysteries. How come there were no teachers there? Anyway, they weren't. So these kids later all told the same story, that they'd seen these craft, they saw these creatures. They later drew pictures, some of which are in my book, that looked very similar. And John Mack flew down there to question them, and he was very good with young people because he had 3 boys of his own, and he was always particularly good at talking to children. He literally got down on their level on the floor and looked them in the eye and got them to talk to him, open up. And some of these interviews, by the way, are online now because there's a documentary called the Ariel Phenomenon by Randy Nickerson, one of Mack's experiencers, as he called them, or abductees, who researched the whole Ariel phenomenon, the whole thing. And he talked to the former students, many of the former students who are now grown-ups, who say that it was the formative experience of their life. And they remember it completely.
And none have retracted.
And none have retracted. Nobody said, "Oh, we made." Actually, I did see. There was one documentary recently where somebody said, "Oh, we made it up," but I don't think that had any credibility. But basically, all the kids say, "I remember it distinctly. Here are the pictures. They drew pictures of the craft." And Mack and Mack's interviews with the kids are on tape. You can see them for yourself. So that was the Ariel phenomenon, and it was one of the best observed UFO events in history, along with Betty and Barney Hill in New Hampshire. So it does stand out. It was really a sensational case.
Well, the Betty and Barney Hill, now that you mentioned that, that's an interesting one. That was the first recorded so-called abduction experience. It was an interracial couple in the early 1960s in New Hampshire. And believe it or not, as I mentioned earlier, the higher up in government you get, the more serious people take this. Barack and Michelle Obama's production company, Higher Ground, is actually producing a film on this event.
I saw that. Yeah, amazing. And Obama said something interesting about you. They asked about UFOs,
Oh,
remember?
yes,
Yeah, and
yes.
he said he was rather reluctant to get into it. But by the way, we found that presidents are not automatically read into the UFO program, by the way. You know, if you're new to this, or anybody would think that, well, if you're president of the United States, the first thing you find out is about all the secrets in the government. Someone, tells you, Mr. President, you're now president, you have to know this. Well, it doesn't work that way, not with UFOs. The UFO effort in the government is so secret, it's stovepiped, as they say, in certain channels. It's not broad-based where everybody at a certain level gets to hear about this thing. The information is kept in certain special access programs, and it's not shared widely. There are very few people who really know, very few people, at a very, very high intelligence level, who really know what is going on and what the government has in the way of evidence, where it is being kept, etc. So anyway, we were talking about Obama. I don't know how much he really knows. Maybe he's going to find out now with the Betty and Barney thing. But anyway, that was a couple, as you said, who were coming back from a delayed honeymoon in 1965, I believe, and going through the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Their car suddenly stalled. They saw a craft. They were taken aboard the craft. They had various experiences. This is by their account, which they didn't actually, they were not eager to tell. It came out later, well, years after it happened. So it was not like they were looking for publicity and ran to tell it. They were very afraid of telling the story. Anyway, it did come out. There was a movie with James Earl Jones. And what is interesting is I found that they also were, and you asked about hypnosis, I'll mention again, they did give their account under hypnotic regression to another psychiatrist, not Mack, who was not in the field at that time in the 60s, but Benjamin Simon, another highly regarded psychiatrist. And those tapes and their clothing and all the evidence that they amassed, all the information is available for public examination at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. So anybody who's, you know, a so-called skeptic, well, I don't believe this, go to New Hampshire, pull out the boxes, listen to the tape-recorded, regressions, interviews that they did, and the psychiatrist himself, who was no believer, said he couldn't figure it out at the end either. So anyway, that's the Betty and Barney Hill story.
Wow. So let's turn, if we could, to the Intercept article. This came out on June 5th of 2023. It was titled, "Intelligence Officials Say U.S. Has Retrieved Craft of Non-Human Origin." Can you tell us about that story?
Okay, so I continue to work with Leslie Kane. She has impeccable sources, very high up in the government, and throughout the UFO field. And by the way, she's interested. She has a broad interest in anomalous events, and she did a book about survival of consciousness, life after death, called "Surviving Death," which is a great title. And it was recently a 6-part Netflix series. So Leslie told me earlier this year that she had made contact with another high-level intelligence guy, David Grusch, who was prepared to come forward with stories about, with the revelation that the U.S. had retrieved actual craft and intact UFOs. They were being hidden away. And that the U.S. and Russia were in a kind of an arms race to develop this technology, because that's, of course, the interest, to figure out how these things can operate at such an extraordinary level. I mean, they turn on a dime, they operate underwater, they become invisible, they have no aerodynamic surfaces, no wings, no tail, no propulsion systems. No one knows how they operate, or who's operating them, where they come from, nothing. But every nation on Earth would love to get this technology. So Grusch was saying this, and he had very good credentials. He's a former decorated soldier in Afghanistan. He worked on the highest level intelligence agencies in the government, the UAP task force, and other agencies. Anyway, and we checked him out very carefully. He is who he said he was. We thought that was a great story. Grusch hadn't told this to anybody else. He was represented by the former Inspector General of the intelligence community. He had a very high-level lawyer representing him. So we tried to interest the Times in the story, by the way, and at that point they weren't interested in the story. We hadn't fully fleshed it out yet, but we ended up going to the Washington Post, which took too long, and then we ended up at the debrief, where it ran.
All right. And David Grusch, the man in question, had spoken. There was a follow-up News Nation interview, and then during the Congressional hearings, he had talked about under oath about what he had titled non-human biologics. In other words, aliens. That didn't make it into your story. Can you tell us about that?
No, it didn't. So we interviewed David Grusch before the News Nation interview appeared. We were the first, Leslie and I, to actually interview him and put the story out in the debrief, which is a very good website on intelligence and defense matters. What was interesting, particularly interesting to us, was that as a former intelligence operative, he was required to go to the government for clearance before he disclosed anything to the press to make sure he wasn't disclosing any secrets. So he did that, just as he was supposed to do. And he said, he told the Defense Department, I'm talking to 2 reporters, Leslie and me, and I'd like to be able to tell them the following things. Would this violate any secrecy restrictions? And the answer came back, no. And so he told us what I said he told us. He did not mention alien bodies at that point. So that was not in the material that the Defense Department cleared for publication, that would not violate any secrecy. They didn't say it was true. They just said, it's okay for you to say this. You want to say this, you're not breaking any classified restriction to say this. So that's what we stuck to. Later in the News Nation interview, he did say that. He said, and in the congressional testimony, he said that alien bodies were recovered along with the debris and an intact craft. So that's why we didn't include the alien bodies.
All right. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the congressional hearings. The article led to these hearings over the summer. I mean, they were fascinating. The most greatest example, I think, of bipartisanship in years. You had AOC, you had Matt Gaetz, both asking very serious questions of very serious men. David Grusch was in attendance, as was Commander David Fravor and Ryan Graves, another top untrained fighter pilot.
Yeah, it was interesting that this hearing of the House Subcommittee on, I forgot, I think it was
Oversight.
Oversight, yeah. It was the Oversight Committee and the Subcommittee on National Security, something like that. And that attracted some very unusual bedfellows, right. Including, as you said, Matt Gaetz and Anna Marie Luna and Tim Burchett, and as well as AOC and who's the senator who's running for Senate in California now, Schiff. So he even showed up, even though he's not on the subcommittee, he's on the regular committee. So, and why people like Gaetz and Luna and Burchett, who are very much involved in the speaker fight and very right-wing conservative, why they're very attracted to, along with the guy from Fox News, who's the guy who was fired recently. Tucker Carlson. Yes. Why they're attracted to this issue is an interesting question, but they're very good on this issue. They're very good. Whatever else they say, on this issue, they're pressing for more disclosed transparency. Anyway, how did we get to this point? We were talking about the hearing. Yes. So there was this hearing where Grusch and Dave Fravor and Ryan Graves testified, and it was amazing, because among other things, Grusch said to Congress, he kind of called their bluff, and he said, you want more information? I'll give it to you in closed session, because I can't talk about some of these things in public, but I'll give you this information, including where the craft are being held, and the bodies, and death threats. He said people who come forward with information have been killed, and the question was, by whom? By the government, by the aliens? He said both. I mean, that came and passed, and I go, oh my God. So a lot of amazing information came out of that hearing, and there's not going to be another one for a while, apparently, because Congress has clamped down now. There are the people on a high level of these committees who said, oh boy, we're not going to do that again. For whatever reason, that gave out too much information. We can't let the American people have all this information. So anyway, I don't think we're going to see another hearing like that for a while.
Okay, so you've spoken to a lot of folks. A lot of folks, of course, have top secret clearances, and which you don't have, nor do I. And, you know, they've kind of skirted around, answering some of these questions in a way that they're able to. Lou Elizondo often says, "I believe this, I believe that." What do the facts tell you? And you've spoken to all of these people, and you've been able to put some of this stuff on the record, some of which maybe would not pass muster at the New York Times, but you have absolutely no reason to doubt what they've said, and you may have had 10, 12, or more of these instances. What are the facts telling you?
Well, first of all, the government is in possession of a lot of information that is not public. We, the New York Times, made public 3 videos, very short videos, of encounters between Navy pilots and UFOs, which remain the most amazing, perplexing videos of all time. But they are only little pieces of what the government has much more of. We know that. How much information the government has, we don't know. But a lot of it is secret. Should it be classified? Should it not be classified? That's an interesting debate to have. Clearly, there are national security implications to some of this subject. If any nation on Earth can replicate this technology, they would be ahead of every other nation on Earth to a dangerous degree, let's say, okay? Because you'd have an endless power source. Nobody knows how these things get their power. Nobody knows how they fly. Nobody knows how they operate underwater. One guy I interviewed said he was on a submarine when an object flew past him at the speed of sound.
Underwater.
Underwater.
Okay.
That's 700 miles in the air. This was underwater. Nothing, according to the physics we understand, can go 700 miles an hour underwater, by our understanding. Anyway, and we know that there are submerged objects that have been seen by witnesses. So the government knows stuff like this. So I believe, not based on any superior information I have, but just on my reporting so far, that there's certainly a lot more to this subject than we know now. That there's a reality. The government has already said that there's a reality to the UFOs that they never said before. That they're not objects of hallucination, or they're not swamp gas, balloons, natural phenomena, reflections of lights. They are some of those things, by the way.
Yes.
Not every sighting of a UFO is a UFO. A small percentage are, because a lot of people mistake things. We know that. There are reflections of aircraft. There are atmospheric phenomena. There are weather balloons. There are satellites. There's a lot of stuff up there. And not everything someone sees in the sky is a UFO, okay? But some of them are, okay? So, so I believe that there's a reality to this phenomenon that has been well established now. The government now says in the 2021 report that was mandated by Congress, they said that these things are undoubtedly real,
Right.
which is a big breakthrough.
And they detailed in that report, which I have here, there were 11 near misses with fighter pilots. These things are hanging out in restricted U.S. airspace, endangering men and women that serve our country, and endangering national security. And
one of the things, you mentioned Brian Graves, who was one of the witnesses in the last congressional hearing with Fravor and Grusch. Graves told us an amazing story, which we had in the New York Times a few years ago, that he was on an aircraft, he's a fighter pilot, he was on an aircraft carrier, and a fellow pilot came down, and the guy was white as a sheet. And Graves said, "What happened?" And he said, "You won't believe this." He says, "I was up there flying at whatever it is, 35,000 feet with my other craft that was flying next to me. We were two of us flying in tandem. He said, between us came an object. It was a sphere, a giant ball, inside of which was a cube touching the inside of the sphere. All the 6 corners or whatever corners of the cube were touching the inside skin of the sphere. It flew right past us, between us, nearly collided with us. And Graves told us that story. What the hell was that? Anyway, part of it, but that's the kind of information the government has that we don't have.
Right. So disclosure in the UFO community, that's the word that's often bandied about in terms of when the government will tell us everything that they know. What is your prognosis on that? When, if ever, will it happen?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen very soon. I think it'll happen little by little. And by the way, I'm often asked, you know, has the government been dribbling this information out to you, you know, for some ulterior purpose? In other words, are you part of this scheme to dribble out the truth, and why are they leaking you this information? They're not leaking us this information. We got this information through hard reporting, through people who didn't necessarily want to talk to us. We found people who had the information, who were willing to talk to us. A lot of people who have more information don't talk to us. So I don't think it's a plot to dribble out the information. I think it's going to be a while. But I think that the more information that comes out, and a lot has, as I said, it will help bring out other information. And there are people now in Congress, like Grusch and others, who are insisting that this information be disclosed, what can be disclosed to the public.
So maybe we could turn to your children's book and help me pronounce it.
UFOs.
UFOs, okay.
My co-author is sitting in the back.
Yes,
Deborah,
welcome,
my wife.
Deborah Blumenthal. Can you tell us about the genesis of this book and a little bit about it?
I was working on the John Mack book, making a lot of calls and doing interviews, and Debbie, who's a children's book author, kept hearing me on the phone talking about UFOs and my Mack book, and finally she said, well, why don't we write a children's book on UFOs? And it turned out when we looked into it, there are no, we could find it, non-fiction children's picture books on UFOs. There's a lot of, silly stuff, aliens and like you see on TV, yeah, I mean, sensational stuff and fiction. But we wanted a book that really helped librarians and teachers and parents understand what's known and what's not known. So we call it, Mysteries in the Sky. And we say at the end, we don't know the answer to the mystery, but it's a real mystery. I mean, there really are things up there that kids see and grown-ups see. It starts off, by the way, with a kid on the tennis court playing with a friend who sees a UFO, and he's a real kid because he, now grown up, told me the story of meeting John Mack, and he's in my John Mack book, and he told me that when he was a kid, he and a friend saw a UFO on a tennis court. So we have a picture of him by a wonderful artist, Adam Gustafson, on the tennis court. So it's factual, it's non-fiction, it's a way of starting the discussion to make it comfortable, because a lot of parents still find the subject uncomfortable. Kids will ask, are aliens real? Are UFOs real? Do I need to be afraid? Can they kidnap me? Am I going to be abducted? As a parent, these are tough questions. I saw this on TV, is this real? So we put this book out as a way, hopefully, of starting the discussion and providing some solid information to a young audience.
All right. So what are you working on next?
Well, I'm still doing a lot of UFO stuff,
okay.
Like this.
All right.
And there's a lot of stuff is coming, new stuff is coming out all the time. Leslie and I talk several times a week about new witnesses. There are other people like Grusch, some of whom know even more than he does. By the way, he never put his hands on a UFO. He doesn't say he did. His information comes from other high-level people.
Have you talked to folks who have put a hand?
No. I have not. And as I said, I never saw one myself, and Mack didn't either, and Mack thought it kept him more pure to investigate this. He didn't have a dog in the fight. I don't know, I might like to see one. But anyway, so this subject has not lost its interest for me. I still do stuff. We're going to push, different stories to different publications as we get them. But it's very hard to get this stuff in a form that is authoritative, documented. You can go on the internet and find all kinds of strange stories from people, particularly witness stories, which may be perfectly good. I mean, they're the old people's own stories about what they encountered, what they went, but it doesn't take you very far.
Right.
So we're looking for stuff. That's why the government information is particularly useful, by the way, because the government has good instrumentation. People in the government who say they've seen things like Fravor and Graves and Grusch come with particular credibility. So that's why we like their stories. But ordinary people have these stories too. So that's the hard part, to get this stuff on the record and documented to the point where it can be put in the New York Times or other similar mainstream publications.
So you've been a journalist for over 50 years, reported on the Vietnam War, mafia, terrorism. Is this the biggest story you've ever done?
Yes, because when you think of the mysteries that are out there, the biggest mysteries of all, are we alone? How did the universe begin? What happens after we die? Is there a God? And those are the big questions. Everything else pales.
Well, before we turn over to the question and answer period from the audience, I'd like to read a passage from your book. And this was a favorite line of John Mack's. It's from the German poet Rainer Marie Rilke. We must accept our reality as vastly as we possibly can. Everything, even the unprecedented, must be possible within it. This is, in the end, the only kind of courage that is required of us. The courage to face the strangest, most unusual, most inexplicable experiences that can meet us. All right. Well, hopefully we can turn it over to questions from folks. All right, I see a few hands up. Andy has the mic.
Oh, thank you. Maybe three quick things you could comment on. We're inundated now on TV with all these UFO shows. One thing I've heard is that there is some kind of galactic alliance that they've met with members of Congress. Excuse me. The second thing, that they've jammed nuclear sites, maybe to help us protect ourselves from ourselves. And the third, have you met or talked to Bob Lazar?
Okay, I have not talked about, I know who he is. He's come forward with some very interesting information of having worked on and actually putting his hands on a UFO. There's a controversy about him, whether he's telling the truth, not telling it. I have no reason to, one way or the other, but there's a lot of information out there about him. That's one. It's absolutely true that UFOs have flown over missile sites in the West and jammed missile technology. There's a whole book about it by an author named Robert Hastings.
UFOs and nukes.
Pardon me?
UFOs and nukes.
UFOs and nukes. It's a well-known phenomenon that for some reason UFOs have been able to interfere with launch codes. Whether that's because they don't want us to annihilate ourselves, I don't know. But if you just stick to the factual thing, that have there been incidents documented of missile sites being interfered with? Absolutely true. As for this intergalactic alliance, and there's a lot of stuff about a group called Magic 12, Majestic 12. If you go on the internet, you'll find a lot about it. Supposedly, again, this is not, I can't vouch it, but the story is that in the Eisenhower years, contact was made with aliens, and aliens were actually captured or contacted, and they were working together with military experts on secret projects. So Not confirmed at all. There's a document, huh?
Not in the New York Times yet.
Not in the New York Times, not anywhere confirmed, but just to give you an idea of how complicated this is, there's a whole set of documents. If you go online, you'll find the Majestic 12 documents, which look like authentic documents. They have all the markings and this and that. And Leslie and I investigated the subject some time ago, and the problem was that even when there were different versions of some of the same documents. And we were told by a very high level source that the documents had been tampered with. And even if they were original, saying that there were this alien confederation working with Americans, parts of it were not authentic, parts of the document, because they wanted to throw adversarial nations off the track. It got to be a hall of mirrors. I just advise anybody to be very skeptical, even with something that looks like a real document. It's a well-known story that there's an alien confederation, and even an Israeli, high-level Israeli general recently was quoted as to that effect. I think it caused quite a sensation. If you remember, he said that there was alien beings working with humans and different
Intergalactic Federation,
right.
I think it's called.
Yeah, nice to think, but where's the proof? So anyway,
more hands.
Just quickly following up on the communication point, just based on your experience, decades, and people you've met with and so on, if there were some kind of contact, what would you think the nature of that would be? What topics? Why would they want to talk to us? What would they want to talk to us about?
well, John Mack was very insistent that the people he interviewed or counseled believed that the aliens were sending a message to humanity. We are polluting the planet, we're blowing ourselves up with nuclear technology, we need to clean up the planet, clean up the pollution. That was the message many people said they got, and they told John Mack that.
Including the children in the Ariel school phenomenon.
Including children in the Ariel school. So that was a very common theme. Now, other UFO researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who I didn't mention, but Jacobs has written a number of books about contacts with alien beings. He's a Temple University professor who was for a while he was teaching the only UFO course at American University. A very prolific author and quite an interesting researcher himself, and a friend of Max and Bud Hopkins. But Hopkins and Jacobs didn't get the same messages from abductees that Mack got, that pollution is a big problem, humans have to clean up the planet. So again, none of this is confirmed in the sense that it can be documented. It's all witness testimony, which, as I say in my book, gets people convicted in court and executed. Witness testimony can be very powerful, but there's a limit because it can't be reproduced, which is what science always insists on. To prove something, you got to develop a reproducible experiment. And witness testimony, by its very nature, is unique and not reproducible. You can find on the internet all kinds of things, what the aliens would want, why they're making contact with us, why would they make contact, why would they want the contacts, with the nuclear technology suggests that they're worried about us blowing ourselves up. Why would they interfere with the launch codes if they weren't worried? But again, this is an area that's very, very difficult it's outside the stuff we've been able to document. Let's put it that way.
Some other hands up in the back.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I guess there are no such things as coincidences. I was a research assistant for Bud Hopkins in New York City.
Oh, wow.
And you were talking about the Betty and Barney Hill story. My friend's husband, John G. Fuller, he's the one who has those recorded. Well, he's passed away. He's the one who has those recordings and wrote Incident in Exeter, the Betty and Barney Hill story, The Interrupted Journey. And his widow has just produced an off-Broadway show about Betty and Barney Hill in New York.
Wow.
So we'll have to
Yeah,
exchange,
I didn't hear that. That's amazing.
we'll have to exchange information later.
Yeah, I tell the story in The Believer how Fuller got the story about Betty and Barney Hill. They had talked at a church 3 years after the incident happened to them. They talked at a church. As I said, they didn't rush out with their experience. They kept it quiet, but they did talk quietly to a small group at a church, and there was a reporter, a dastardly reporter, present who recorded it apparently, and put out the story, tried to get them to speak. They wouldn't speak. He put out the story in a big sensational paper, the Boston paper. UFO shocker was the headline. And that's how the story got out. And Fuller heard about it, and that's how he investigated. But he broke that story.
In fact, I'm rushing now to meet his widow, Liz Fuller, so I'll have to get your information somewhere. Thank you so much.
More hands. And you have one up front here.
I was wondering if you have heard of Linda Moulton Howe, and she's done a lot of research and has gotten a lot of government documents. Also, if you've read the Brookings Institute report that the government commissioned to see if we were ready to hear about this kind of thing, and the Brookings Institute said, no, we were not ready.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it. I haven't read it, but I certainly know Linda Moulton Howe, who's very active in discussions. She's done a lot with retrieved objects. People have bits and pieces of things that they say came from a UFO. They've been tested. Again, I'm not aware that anything has been absolutely proven so far. Avi Loeb has things that he got from the bottom of the ocean off New Guinea that seem unusual, but again, I don't know that anybody has made a slam dunk that this is alien. Nothing like this has been, ever seen on Earth. But she's well known and she's very active.
At the Brookings Institute?
Yeah, I don't know. I've heard of that report. People say, is the world ready? Well, people have been exposed to this phenomenon for a long time. More people have had experiences than can be imagined. A lot of them don't make it public. So you're not telling them anything new. If you say, yes, there are UFOs, yes, aliens are real. So there'd be quite a few people who wouldn't be terribly shocked and surprised. Whether there'd be a worldwide panic, I don't know. But who has the right to make that decision? If we find that we are not alone in the universe, who should say, well, we're going to withhold that from the rest of humanity? Isn't that information that's not, by the way, a scientific secret? That's not a formula for a new weapon. If you say, we have proof that there's intelligence in the universe, that doesn't give away any secret, except a big secret, but no defense secrets. So we should be entitled to that.
You have a question in the back?
So I was just wondering, given that there's lots of stuff out there, would you say there's more misinformation than fact? And how would the average person really sort through it when it comes to this kind
Yeah,
of
very good question. There's definitely a lot of misinformation, which is promulgated by the entertainment industry. And some very good films are really fiction, like, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the Spielberg movie about the Call Home, E.T. Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there, which people accept. After a while, it begins to, sound like fact. So it's very difficult to sort it out. And it's of endless fascination, by the way. It's obviously, every day there's movies, TV shows, articles about aliens, so I'd say it's very difficult to figure out what's really true and what can be confirmed. But that's why it's so hard to write for mainstream publications, because you really have to stick to facts and you can't go. We've never talked about aliens in the New York Times, really, because we can't prove it. I mean, there's no evidence. You know, there's the old saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So evidence is not there. It doesn't prove that it doesn't exist, but it doesn't prove that it does exist. It's still open. So it's very difficult. I mean, it's a subject that people have to be very, very careful about and skeptical about.
Couple more questions? Hands.
Over this way.
Gentlemen.
Ralph, my brother Gabriel produces Ancient Aliens. It's a TV show on the History Channel about, you know, all this stuff. And he's probably interviewed everybody on the planet. Yeah, that's why he texted me this morning when I sent him a notice of this event. He said, say hi to Ralph. So I forgave. But what I wanted to really say was this fascinating number of books written by this author named Preston Dennett. Preston, anybody, Dennett, D-E-N-N-E-T-T. All he writes about UFOs, but all he does is goes back over old newspaper files. He's not writing his own UFO stories. He's not really even interviewing it. He goes back to newspapers that were published from the 1840s on. Clips out the article, sticks it on a page, that's his book. Thousands of accounts. UFOs over Topanga Canyon, UFOs over Nevada, UFOs over New York, UFOs over Washington, D.C., UFOs over Baja, California. He just bangs these books. He's got a nice thing going.
Right.
But the deal is all of it came out of newspapers. And when you read the accounts, there's a tremendous similarity of accounts.
Right.
Across the board and over the last 150 years. He wrote one book called UFOs over schools, or schoolyards. 100 accounts, he does the Ariel. But apparently, he found at least 100 of them. He thought initially when he began to write that book, there'd only be a few. He dug into the newspaper files. I guess a lot of the stuff is digitalized. He found 100 of them and he stuck them in a book. It's really cool. You read some Dennis books, you'll come away thinking, there is something going on.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting because I have some of these stories in my book, The Believer. It turns out that newspapers did have accounts of heavier-than-air flights before the Wright brothers. Back in the 1880s, and stories about planes landing with alien beings, having discussions with humans, looking for water. I mean, all kinds of really strange things, all in the newspapers, as you say. Very strange. And the accounts go back. Jacques Vallée, the great writer on anomalies, has documented the stuff going back to the Upanishads, you know, the Bible, you know,
Since antiquity,
yeah,
cave
cave
drawings.
art, cave drawings, Peruvian, you know, tomb art showing what looked like astronauts. Yeah, it goes way back. So again, interesting.
Yeah, this is a little odd, but we're talking about odd stuff. Have you encountered anyone who's keyed in on the adrenochrome possibility that feeds in on this at all? No.
What's that?
Apparently, it's a drug, and it's a very expensive drug that comes from very dark places, but that was one of the things that apparently the dark forces, if you will, and the dark projects are running that business in order to be able to fund all this stuff. And I don't know if I've heard anything about that.
I have not. But Mack did experiment with ayahuasca. As a psychiatrist, he was very interested in mind-altering drugs, LSD, etc. It is interesting that he was able to, you know, reach different levels of consciousness, both with drugs and with the breathing discipline. Yeah, I mean, they're very strange stories of what these drugs can do and what they do to the body, and where they take, you know, people, and in some ways, the accounts of people who've had alien experiences, being on ships and being immersed in liquid to travel to different, you know, galaxies and so, they sound like drug dreams, you know. So again, I'm not familiar with that, but
It's okay.
generally I've heard heard stories like that.
Questions over here?
Just real quick, can you comment on international evidence and investigation? Number one, and number two is there a great consistency in terms of the description of these aliens and what they look
Yes.
like?
There is. There's differences. There's a great variety of beings that have been described. Reptilian beings, adoptive figures, so-called very humanoid type figures, female types, non-sexual differentiation between beings. So you get some of the same stories, and yet no two stories seem exactly alike. So it's not like people are telling the same story that they heard or saw. That's interesting. That's what struck Mack, that it is not like people are repeating one basic story that they've seen somewhere. And yet, on the other hand, there's a certain symmetry between the stories that it falls into certain patterns, like the experiments on the ships. I forgot the first thing you said.
International.
Yeah, it's all over. It is all over. It is in South America, it is in Japan, it is in Asia. That's a common misconception, that this is something that only happens in America. Now, we have good communications here, we have a very vigorous press and an entertainment industry, so things get picked up here, very easily. But Latin America is the source of a lot of very strange stories, including something that was on a documentary not long ago on a place in Brazil called Virginia, right, where supposedly 3 girls saw an alien being. Mack actually went down there to interview them.
It was a recording of that. We saw, I was unresolved. We all saw that on TV.
You saw
They
it?
removed everything.
Right. And the guy who actually, again, this was from the documentary, the guy who transported the alien being to the hospital, he died later of some strange ailment. And there was a guy in the documentary made by James Fox, who's quite a prolific UFO researcher. They actually went to the home of a guy who knew about the story, and the guy chased him away with a gun.
He bought all the materials.
Yeah.
Paid $300,000 for the material.
Right.
And he's gonna release eventually.
Well, maybe it'll come out, but the guy, they said, this is the guy who knows the real story, let's talk to him. And he was up in the window, he said, get away or I'll shoot you. Anyway, very strange. But actually, there's a very famous episode that has been documented in Colares, is it? Colares? Where UFOs were seen over this village and dropped a strange substance like hard to describe, like filmy residue. So that was picked up later and studied, documented because hundreds of people saw it and reported it, Colares. So the answer is it's everywhere.
Thanks. With all the information you were talking about with regards to it being an arms race because of the technology, has it come to light with your research, have any of these whistleblowers or people with a lot of this information comment on the technology itself? Because the technology itself would be so drastic from what we have today. When you think about, speed of light is, universal speed limit. Our technology today can't even come to a fraction of the speed of light. The closest star system is, roughly 2-3 light years away now. And you think about the vast distances that have to be traveled. The technology required to do that is mind-boggling compared to what we know today. I think even Stephen Hawking said that if there are aliens out there, we should be hiding from them because they would be so far beyond us that we would be insects, perhaps even lower. They wouldn't care. And we should be hiding from the aliens because we can't even come close to even fathom traveling such distances. So if we do have this technology, that's really quite startling. That that they would be trying to reverse engineer that. It would be so far beyond what we have today. Has any of that come forward? Just just the physics behind it. And what would be required to,
Grusch said there is an arms race going on between U.S. and Russia to identify and recreate this technology, because, as you say, it would be mind-blowing. First of all, they seem to have power source that we cannot identify. That there's no machine. When they look into a UFO, people have said that, people with witnesses, they don't see any machinery. It seems to be powered by mental activity somehow. Also, there are no aerodynamic surfaces. Dave Fravor said that with the Tic Tac. There's no wings, no tail, no jet exhaust. And actually, somebody said something else very interesting. I just heard recently that one of these objects underwater, when it moved, it didn't seem to displace the water, which is very interesting. So it seems to have some technology that the molecules went right through the water, that it didn't push the water somehow. So as you say, the technology would be revolutionary. Clearly, every nation on Earth would like to get to it first. And there's a lot of research being done, completely secret. We have no idea who's doing it, and where and why. And actually, one of the reasons private companies are not being helpful in this discussion coming forward is because this is technology that they would very much like to have. I mean, imagine if Lockheed Martin, I'm making this up now, if Lockheed Martin could figure out what an endless power source would be, or a machine that propels, that doesn't need any working parts. Gee, that would be a great invention to patent. So yeah, the research is definitely going on, very secret in many parts of the world, but I have no idea what it is.
All right, we have time for one more question, and then we'll have one signing in the back.
I'm just wondering, the people who have had these closer encounters, maybe a feeling they have an abduction or a sighting or whatever, do they come away after initial experience with some sort of commonality that kind of is an umbrella over the rest of their life, of change of some sort?
That's a good question. There are, first of all, the people who've had these experiences come from all different walks of life. There's no commonality in the people who have the experiences. It's not just one kind of person. Many of the people, at least the people who talked to Mack, said afterwards that yes, they were terrorized. Almost everyone said they're terrorized by their encounter with this, alien beings or alien entities. But they also felt more spiritual afterwards, that it was not totally negative, that there was an added dimension to their lives. So that seemed to be a common, but the terror was very common also. And people who've gone through this have said that they wouldn't wish it on anybody. And by the way, it does seem to run in families, according to the research. So parents who've seen their kids encounter this, or who hear from their kids that they have had a similar experience, that those parents are terrified because they know how horrific it was for them, and they think, oh my God, it's now happening to my kid. Now, why it runs in families, are aliens tracking different, families for some scientific purpose? Who knows? But that's where it is.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for